For more than half a century, the world has searched for an alternative to the US dollar. Every few years, a new contender appears. The euro, the yen, the yuan, gold, crypto. Each time the same headlines return. The end of dollar dominance. And each time, nothing actually changes. Not because the dollar is flawless, but because the global system is built in a way that makes leaving it far more dangerous than staying inside it. The dollar does not dominate because countries love America. It dominates because global trade, global debt, and global stability have been engineered around it. If you are a government running deficits, you need deep capital markets. If you are a corporation trading across borders, you need liquidity. If you are a central bank trying to survive a crisis, you need safety. And safety in the modern financial system has only meant one thing: the US dollar. This is why countries that openly criticize American power still hold trillions in dollar reserves. Why rivals complain about dollar weaponization while increasing their exposure to it. Why even attempts to escape the system often strengthen it instead. The uncomfortable truth is this: the world is not trapped because it lacks alternatives. It is trapped because the cost of abandoning the dollar is immediate, visible, and catastrophic, while the cost of staying feels distant, abstract, and survivable, at least for now. And that illusion of stability is exactly where the danger begins. The dollar did not become dominant by accident. It was designed that way. In 1944, as World War II was still raging, 44 countries gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Europe was shattered. Empires were collapsing. Gold was scarce. The United States was different. It controlled the majority of the world's gold reserves. Its factories were intact. Its economy was expanding while others were rebuilding. So the post-war system was built around a simple promise: the dollar would be as good as gold. Currencies were pegged to the dollar. The dollar was pegged to gold, and America became the anchor of global finance. Even when that promise collapsed in 1971, the system did not. Instead, it evolved. Oil was priced in dollars. Debt was issued in dollars. Global trade contracts were settled in dollars. Over time, the dollar stopped being just a currency. It became infrastructure. Banks, payment systems, shipping contracts, insurance markets, all optimized themselves around dollar liquidity. Once that happened, leaving the system stopped being a political decision. It became a mathematical problem. Because abandoning the dollar meant currency volatility, capital flight, debt crises, and for most countries, the risk was simply too high. This is how dominance becomes untouchable, not through force alone, but through dependence. And once dependence is universal, power no longer needs to be asserted. It is assumed. Once the dollar became global infrastructure, it also became leverage. At first, that leverage was subtle. Access to American markets, preferential trade terms, the implicit protection of being inside the system. But over time, something changed. The United States discovered that control over dollar flows meant control over behavior. Banks that violated U.S. rules were cut off from dollar clearing. Countries that defied Washington faced frozen reserves. Entire economies were locked out of the financial system without a single shot being fired. Sanctions were no longer symbolic. They were surgical. And because the dollar sat at the center of global finance, these measures didn't need global approval. They only needed compliance. SWIFT became a choke point. Correspondent banking became a weapon. Payment access became conditional. This is where the paradox began to form. The more effective financial power became, the more frequently it was used. And the more frequently it was used, the more visible the risk became. For allies, it was reassurance. For rivals, it was a warning. For everyone else, it was a realization. The global economy was no longer neutral. It was governed, and that governance rested on a single currency. The dollar had moved beyond trade and reserves. It had become enforcement. Every system that relies on dominance eventually faces the same problem: overuse. As sanctions multiplied and financial pressure became routine, countries began asking a dangerous question: what happens if we are next? Not because they planned to challenge the United States, but because dependency itself had become a vulnerability. Holding dollars meant exposure. Using dollar-based systems meant surveillance. Relying on American financial infrastructure meant political risk. So slowly, quietly, alternatives began to emerge. Bilateral trade agreements in local currencies, energy contracts outside the dollar, new payment systems designed to bypass traditional channels. None of these efforts were strong enough to replace the dollar, but they didn't need to be. Their purpose was not escape, it was insurance. And this is where the trap reveals itself. Every attempt to reduce dependence weakens the system slightly, but abandoning it completely is impossible. So the world stays inside while preparing for a future outside. This creates fragmentation, parallel systems, redundancy, and redundancy is expensive. For the United States, this means something critical. The dollar remains dominant, but its dominance becomes less efficient, less trusted, and more contested. Not collapsing, but slowly eroding. Reserve currency status is often described as a privilege. In reality, it is a burden, because when the world depends on your currency, your economy is no longer your own. The United States must supply dollars to the global system. That means persistent trade deficits. It means exporting financial stability at the cost of domestic imbalance. Cheap imports keep inflation low, but they also hollow out manufacturing. Capital inflows strengthen the dollar and weaken exports. Over time, the same forces that support global dominance begin to strain the domestic economy. This is not a policy failure, it is structural. Every reserve currency nation faces it. Britain did. America is now living it, and walking away is not an option. If the U.S. reduces dollar supply, global liquidity tightens. Markets panic. Crises spread. If it prints too much, confidence erodes. Inflation rises. Alternatives accelerate. So the system demands a constant balancing act, one that becomes harder as the world grows more fragmented. The dollar's dominance gives America power, but it also removes flexibility. And the more the system depends on the dollar, the less room the United States has to maneuver. This is the cost of being the center of everything. Despite all of this, the dollar remains irreplaceable, not because no one wants to challenge it, but because no alternative can absorb its role. The euro lacks political unity. China's yuan lacks trust and transparency. Gold lacks scalability. Digital currencies lack stability. But the real reason is deeper. Replacing the dollar would require rebuilding the entire architecture of global finance, debt markets, trade settlement, risk management. That transition would trigger massive instability, especially for the countries pushing for change. So even as nations hedge against the dollar, they continue to rely on it. This creates a global stalemate. Everyone knows the system is flawed. Everyone knows dependence is risky. And yet, no one can afford to leave first. The dollar survives not because it is perfect, but because the cost of replacement is higher than the cost of endurance. For now, the end of dollar dominance will not look like a crash. There will be no single announcement, no replacement ceremony. What's coming is quieter, fragmentation, more regional trade blocs, more parallel payment systems, more hedging against dollar exposure. The dollar will still dominate, but it will dominate a smaller share of a more divided system. This is how reserve currencies actually decline, not through sudden rejection, but through slow irrelevance at the margins. Each workaround reduces efficiency. Each bypass increases cost. Each hedge lowers trust. The system becomes heavier, more complex, less resilient, and paradoxically, more fragile. Because when crises hit fragmented systems, coordination fails. Liquidity arrives late. Confidence breaks faster. Recovery takes longer. The dollar doesn't disappear in this world. It becomes contested infrastructure, still essential, still powerful, but no longer unquestioned. This is why the dollar's irreplaceability is dangerous, not because it will collapse, but because the world cannot move past it. The global economy is locked inside a system everyone depends on, but no one fully trusts. For the United States, this creates a strategic dilemma. Use financial power too aggressively, and fragmentation accelerates. Use it too cautiously, and credibility weakens. There is no clean exit. The dollar will remain at the center of global finance for years to come. But the era of effortless dominance is ending. What replaces it is not a new currency, but a more unstable world. One where power is diffused, trust is scarce, and financial systems are no longer neutral. The most dangerous systems are not the ones that fail. They are the ones that cannot be replaced, and the dollar is the most powerful example of that reality.